Breaking news today, the judge overseeing President-elect Donald Trump's 2020 election interference case has granted special counsel Jack Smith's request to suspend deadlines in the case. Earlier today, Jack Smith's team requested that the court vacate the remaining deadline so it has time to assess this unprecedented circumstance and determine the appropriate course going forward. Earlier this week, Jack Smith began discussions with Department of Justice officials on how to begin winding down Trump's federal case, which includes his classified documents case in Florida. During the presidential election campaign, President-elect Trump had suggested he could fire Jack Smith and pardon himself. The Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel currently advises against criminal prosecution of a sitting president. 2 days after Donald Trump was elected 47th President of the United States, half of America is still left in shock. The blame game has begun inside the Democratic Party as they start to pick up the pieces after Trump swept through swing states in the popular vote by over 4 million votes. Now, Washington prepares for the next administration as Trump heads into the White House with control of the Senate and most likely the House. Joining me now is The Hill's national political reporter, Cate Martel. Cate, it is so great to see you. I hope you've gotten sleep since election night, but let's dive right into it. We know that Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents are still processing the election results, and they remain divided in so many ways. This was certainly a sweep for Republicans, but look, there's a large swath of the country that is very unhappy and frightened in the wake of these results. How complicated is it going to be moving forward, and what does former President Trump or President-elect Trump have to do now?
Yeah, Julia, I think if this week has shown me anything, it is how bitter and partisan the United States has come, that we have half of this country who feels totally devastated and disgusted by what happened on Tuesday, argue they're worried about their reproductive rights for women. They're worried about a lot of the issues going forward and are really surprised by the results. And on the other half, you have the other half of the country who feels completely vindicated and ecstatic, that they argue that the political institutions that are in place to represent them haven't been doing so for the past several years. And they feel that they are now going to have control back. Now, I think it's interesting, we've been looking at polling and talking about polling for the past several months, and nearly every poll shows that Americans were concerned about the economy and the direction that the country is going in. Both of those factors are going to favor a challenger. So I think that is a factor going forward. Some Democrats did believe that former President Trump, now President-elect Trump, was the exception to this rule, that yes, it would usually favor a challenger, but Trump came with a lot of political baggage, and they argued that they could pull some of that away. So, I think going forward, it's going to be important to find how we can find common ground. Yesterday, President Biden delivered remarks from the Rose Garden saying that there will be no issues in certifying the results. He will pass the baton, and going forward, these are how the institutions were put into place and the systems are working correctly. It was not the outcome that Democrats wanted, but we have to trust the systems, Julia.
We know that Trump's campaign manager, Susie WS, has been credited quite a bit with Trump's success and really pushing and drilling in on that message on the economy and immigration. Well, she is his pick to be White House Chief of Staff, becoming the first woman to ever hold that position in U.S. history. Cate, what else do we know more about her?
Yeah, Susie WS is the first puzzle piece for the Trump administration to fill out all of these appointments and nominations. Now, she is widely respected as a Republican consultant. She's from Florida, and she doesn't necessarily come from the Trump world. She's represented wide swath of Republicans from all across the political spectrum. Now, in 2012, she actually worked for his former senator, or soon-to-be former Senator Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. In 2012, she worked for Rick Scott's gubernatorial campaign, and she actually also briefly worked on Ron DeSantis's gubernatorial campaign a few years ago. So she has been all over the political spectrum. She also has some roots in working for Reagan's campaign. So I think it's going to be interesting to see going forward, because she is the pick and she is a very well-respected Republican within the party, that how will that influence other picks within the administration?
Certainly a well-seasoned campaign operative, so we'll see how she performs and how she, sort of carries out her job in a government capacity. So that'll be interesting to watch. We know that there's also a lot of speculation about who will fill other top jobs in Trump's administration. I've heard a number of names: Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik for UN Ambassador. So who can we expect to see going forward?
Yeah, this is the question now for the next 2 months, is how we figure how the Trump administration fill out these positions. Now, two names that we have to talk about are Elon Musk and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I don't expect that either one of them will necessarily end up with a cabinet job. But I will say that Elon Musk specifically will have Trump's ear. He does have a lot of influence, so it'll be interesting to see how he ends up playing a role in the campaign and from the campaign into the administration. And for RFK Jr., we're not necessarily expecting him to have a cabinet role, but he could potentially have a role in food and health regulation going forward in the administration. We are also, like you mentioned, watching for Senator Marco Rubio, potential pick for Secretary of State. Doug Burgum, the governor of North Dakota, who was famously floated on Trump's VP shortlist, he possibly could be a pick for energy secretary. And then another name that we have to discuss is Stephen Miller. He was a senior advisor for President Trump's first administration, and going forward, I fully expect to see that he'll probably be back in the next administration. He is the architect of former President Trump, now President-elect Trump's immigration policies. And I think that that's because that's still very much a priority. We should absolutely be seeing more from Stephen Miller going forward.
It's been fascinating to really watch the auditioning for this role, whether it was on the campaign trail or on cable news. I mean, it's still continuing as a lot of these potential picks really flood the airwaves. We know that Donald Trump famously likes to watch cable news. So I want to move to control of Capitol Hill. It's all but certain that Republicans will likely keep control of the House. We know that there's some outstanding races. So if Republicans maintain control of the House, what does this ultimately mean for former President Trump? I mean, I imagine that with a Republican-controlled Senate and House, he's able to really steamroll his agenda right through Capitol Hill.
Yes, Julia, if they have the trifecta, that will really help the president's future priorities in his administration. Now, Decision Desk HQ and the Hill do forecast that the chances that House Republicans will hold on to the lower chamber is roughly 93%. So that is likely the reality that we're going to be heading into. Now, if that is the case, the magic trifecta of having access to the White House, the House, and the Senate, the way in modern political history that when one party controls it, the way they govern is through something called reconciliation. And that is this shortcut loophole to be able to pass legislation without a filibuster. So they don't even need to work with Democrats. There are a few caveats to that. It can only be based on policies that have to do with spending or taxes. So it can't necessarily fuel their entire short list of proposals for their priority for the first 100 days, but it absolutely will be a way that I expect that Republicans, assuming they have control of the House and the Senate, will work on Capitol Hill.
So speaking of Capitol Hill, we know that Republicans gain control of the Senate with 52 seats. You would think that that would mean Trump appointments should easily fly through. I know that there's some questions about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for example. You mentioned Elon Musk. We don't know what positions they get or even if they'll get a formal position. But will this be easy for Trump administration appointees or nominees to essentially get through the Senate at this point?
Yeah, Julia, I think it's safe to say it'll be relatively easy for Republicans to get through the nominees in the Senate because of how many seats they have. And when you actually start looking at the makeup of who the Senate Republicans are, there are a lot more people who are centered in Trump world than they were back in 2016. So I think they're going to have an easier time than they even did in 2016 in passing, some of these nominations. When you look at the makeup of the Senate, there aren't as many moderate Republicans as there used to be. The Mitt Romneys, the John McCains, the Rob Portmans of the world. Those were people who, pushed back on a lot of the conservative Republicans that are in Trump world, and they no longer exist. They've been pushed out. So now when you start to look at the makeup of the Senate, the two moderates left are Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. They're two senators that I do expect could put up a fight with some potential nominees, but they wouldn't necessarily even put it over the edge. If Republicans have 52 or even 53 seats, those are only two Republicans. They still have a comfortable majority. So I don't expect too much of a fight for Republicans to pass and confirm President-elect Trump's nominees, but it's not necessarily a given depending on who they choose.
Cate, finally, we know that there still are some races playing out in the House, and also, Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania at the time of this taping has not yet conceded in his race, very narrowly, running against David McCormick, but we know that at least the Associated Press has called it for McCormick. Let's talk about these races that are still playing out.
Yeah, so in the House, there are roughly 15 seats that have still not been called. And, it's split between the two parties. The chances of, the House going to Republican control is fairly high. Now, the Senate, we're kind of talking about several races. DDHQ, our partner, has called Nevada for Senator Jackie Rosen. So that was pretty big for Democrats to stop the bleed in the Senate. And the two races that we're still talking about are Arizona and Pennsylvania. Now, in Arizona, Democrat Ruben Gallego does appear to be ahead and is the more likely pick to end up winning that race, but it still has not been called. And like you mentioned, in Pennsylvania, it is favoring the GOP challenger, David McCormick, over Senator Bob Casey, but it looks like the margins might be so tight that it may go to an automatic recount of the votes. So there's still a few moving parts, but we're starting to see little rumblings of what the makeup will likely be. And that's why we're saying that it is going to be so incredibly tight in the margins for Republicans because of how these races are starting to shape up.
Cate Martel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks as always.
A federal judge in Texas has struck down a Biden administration policy that provides a pathway to citizenship for undocumented spouses of American citizens. That policy allows undocumented immigrants who are married to U.S. citizens to obtain green cards without needing to leave the country. It was initially put on hold in August while it was being challenged in court, but the ruling Friday did away with the policy completely. U.S. District Judge J. Campbell Barker ruled that the Biden administration has not been authorized by Congress to create such a policy. The Biden administration can still appeal the ruling. Across America, racist text messages from unrecognized phone numbers have flooded the phones of Black Americans after the presidential election. Now, authorities are investigating who and what's behind these messages. Joining us now is The Hill's race and politics reporter, Cheyanne Daniels, with more insight. Cheyanne, thank you so much for joining us. Really concerning story, particularly after a pretty tough election cycle. First of all, I want to talk about what kind of language, I know it's disturbing, is being used in these text messages.
Yes, well, thank you, Julia, for having me here. As you mentioned, the language is quite disturbing. Images that we are seeing of the text message is saying things such as, "You have been selected to pick cotton. Make sure to report to the nearest plantation ASAP," or will say a certain time and that there is a bus to pick them up. So, just frankly, downright racist language that is being sent to Black Americans around the nation.
So this, like I said, disturbing, it's harmful, it's frightening. How is the Black community responding to this? I understand that the NAACP has put out a statement as well.
Yes. So I think, when we first saw that these messages were coming out, there was a little bit of disbelief. There was a little bit of, is this serious? Did anybody else get
Right.
this? And then once it started to come to light that this was not just, one person or a one-off instance, something a couple of people were seeing, but again, in multiple states, we are seeing these messages hitting the phones of high school students, college-age students. It's really not discriminating against which Black Americans this message is being sent to. So it started with disbelief, then it's shock, it's outrage, it's anger. As you mentioned, we heard from the NAACP president and CEO, Derek Johnson, who said that these messages are as a result of Tuesday's election, and the election now of President-elect Donald Trump. And he claims that it is because of the former president's fear-mongering, his embracing of hatred and racism and his own rhetoric, that this is what is now causing these messages to be sent.
So we know that the people who have reported receiving these text messages said their names were included in the text. Which states have been targeted so far? And I guess just the fact that individual names are being included, I mean, is there any sort of legal pushback that we're seeing by authorities?
Yes, so we are seeing these messages appear in states like New York, Pennsylvania, California, Alabama, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. So again, really spread out all around the country. As you mentioned, some folks have said that their name is included. Not all of those text messages has an individual's name on it, but there have been reports of it being personalized. So we know the FBI is currently investigating as well as working with local law enforcement to try to find out where these texts are originating from. As of right now, the texts are being sent anonymously, and it's unclear how they are targeting or how they have even managed to personalize the messages that are being sent.
Cheyanne Daniels, thank you so much for joining us to give us an update on this. I'm sure we'll be in touch as the story develops.
Thank you.
The biggest issue of the election was the economy. High inflation was a major concern for both working class families and CEOs alike. And now that Trump is set to retake the White House in January, business leaders seem to be optimistic. Joining us now to break down the reasons behind that optimism is CEO and chairman of Stagwell, chairman of the Harris Poll, and former senior advisor to the Clintons, Mark Penn. Mark, it's great to see you. We saw that Wall Street had a pretty big bump in the past 24 hours after the election was called. The Dow jumped more than 3% Wednesday morning. What are investors excited about?
Well, I think the kind of secret of the election was that business was really rooting for Trump to win in a lot of different ways. They were expecting less regulation, lower taxes, perhaps lower interest rates, perhaps not. We did a survey of CEOs, and the vast majority of the CEOs thought that the global economy and their economy was going to function better under Trump.
Right. So we know that heading into the election, there was some concern from experts over Trump's economic proposals, specifically his tariffs plan. But according to a survey of 100 CEOs across the world, Trump was actually favored over Harris to lead the global economic recovery. Mark, are there concerns over his proposals shared by the group of CEOs, or do they see the benefits of Trump's policies outweighing the costs?
Well, we actually looked, Julia, at global CEOs. And so it's very interesting. The US CEOs, when we asked them who is going to do a better job at expanding the global economy, the US CEOs all said Trump. The China CEOs all said Harris.
Huh.
And remember, we don't know what Trump is going to actually do, but there's definitely FOT, fear of Trump. I think China fears what he could do, right, in terms of tariffing their goods and what impact it could have on their economy. So, a lot of what Trump does is to open up kind of bargaining bargaining wedges, right, that he uses to negotiate. And the most important thing about a bargaining chip is that you have to believe it's true. So you have to first believe that he would put 20% tariffs on everything. And, if they walk away from the table, then he will. It's like, I'll never forget when state and local governments walked away from the table on the tax negotiation. I don't think the Republicans ever planned on taking that away, but the Democrats preferred not to negotiate. And I think the same thing will happen here. I don't think he's planning to do that, but if they don't negotiate, he will. And US CEOs are saying, you know what, if he's going to benefit our manufacturing and our economy and the auto industry in particular, okay, we're okay with that.
We know that Trump has been deeply critical of the relationship with some of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, specifically Mexico and China, as we alluded to. But what's been the reaction, I guess I should say, to Trump's reelection from business and political leaders outside of the U.S.?
Well, it really depends who you are. I mean, European leaders are always horrified. Uh, in Mexico and in Mexico, I think the question that they have is that they know they're going to have to negotiate here. They know that Trump is going to be about preserving Midwestern manufacturing and other jobs, and in a way that the Democratic administration recently has been more about favoring the coast. And so that's gonna set things off. So it'll be very interesting to see. Basically, Mexico blew Biden off whenever they would ask for anything, and Trump, however, seems to deploy these wedges that gets people to the table. And I think again that the business is expecting that that's what's going to happen.
So, based on your survey of CEOs, how will the results impact their business strategy going forward?
Well, I think that really depends industry to industry. I do think people are looking at less immigration. They're looking at issues on trade. They're looking at whether or not they should bring back manufacturing to the U.S. or not. They're looking at their ability to invest more money if corporate taxes are lower. I think a lot of these elements of business strategy are really going to be determined. Now, people really aren't going to know what's what until, say, the State of the Union, and the president really picks what issues he's going to do. I do think that business thinks that the corporate tax is going to remain low, and that is the critical component for free cash flow and for investment by business in jobs.
I want to switch gears a little bit here. The polls predicted a tight race, but Trump essentially ran away with it all. We know that he's on track to win the popular vote. As the chairman of the Harris poll, what do you think was the disconnect between the polling and the election results at the end of the day?
Well, the disconnect was less than it seems. I know I wrote an article. I wrote an article about 2 weeks out in which I said that I thought Trump was more likely to win when you look at the major factors in the race. The polls all converged pretty close to the center. Our polls had him winning most of the states, the ones done the night before by Harris X, and within the margin of error. Now, what we see happened is that basically he performed about 3 or maybe 4 points better everywhere. And when everything was 50-50, that 3-point bump really then brought over an enormous number of states in the Electoral College, and even perhaps the popular vote, though the popular vote will tighten. For whatever reason, they don't really bother counting votes in California for like 2 weeks. So
Right.
When they get them all in, I think it's going to be relatively close. I think he'll still win. I think the Republicans still get the House. But that 1 or 2 point shift, right, that really it had a tremendous impact on the final outcome of the election.
Mark Penn, as always, thank you so much for your insights. Been quite a week for pollsters, so we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. I'm glad I'm not Ann Seltzer, however.
Thank you. Israel's evacuating its citizens from Amsterdam after an attack on Israeli soccer fans who were there to watch a match on Thursday night. According to the Amsterdam mayor, roaming groups of young people on scooters and on foot sought out Israeli fans, punching them and kicking them, and then quickly fleeing the scenes. 5 people were treated in hospitals and another 20 to 30 suffered light injuries. Authorities say the assaults were fueled by calls on social media to target Jewish people. It came after officials banned a planned pro-Palestinian demonstration near the stadium. Officials in Amsterdam, as well as President Biden, have condemned the violence. A sheriff lieutenant in Clark County, Ohio, has been placed on leave after making a Facebook post saying he would refuse to help people if they voted Democratic. Sartaj Singh with Nexstar Nation's WDTN in Dayton has the details of the post and the reaction from the community.
Lieutenant John Rogers has been placed on leave since he made those social media posts that were made before the election. Now, the sheriff's office tells me that they take this matter very seriously. 2 News was able to obtain Lieutenant John Rogers' personnel files. In those files, the sheriff's office was made aware of a series of Facebook posts made by the Clark County lieutenant. One of those posts reads, "I am sorry if you support the Democrat Party, I will not help you." Another reads, "At the end of the day, I will require you to provide proof of who you voted for if you ask me for help. Weapons and ammo are not cheap." A letter from Rogers addressed to a major in the Clark County Sheriff's Office states that the post might have been made due to a side effect of a sleep medication that he used. The Sheriff's Office says that there is no timetable for his return. Residents say they were shocked when they heard about the posts.
I think it's awful, but at the same time, if he's talking about taking medication, I do know a friend who did weird things, so I'd rather give him the benefit of the doubt.
In a letter sent from the sheriff to Rogers, the office states that they would like him to stop using the medication, stating that it impairs his ability to perform the requirements of his post. In Clark County, Sartaj Singh, 2 News.
Sartaj Singh, thank you for your reporting. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.